And in the script element, we can remove the spaces, and we're going to add an attribute called src equals, and we're going to load the JavaScript file that we just created, which is inside the scripts folder. So we'll type scripts and then a slash to go into this folder, and we'll load the file 11-todo-list.js and save. So now I'm going to drag this file down here so I can see both the HTML and JavaScript at the same time. Close this for now, and I can close the other code for now as well. And finally, let's open this in our browser. So we'll right click, open with Live Server. And let's also open the console on this page. Right click, click Inspect, and click the console. Now, one more thing I'm going to do for this video is I'll rearrange my windows so that we can have the final design at the bottom. Let's start by creating the HTML elements. Let's go to the body, and we'll actually create a paragraph element to start. Inside the paragraph, we'll put the text to-do list. Next, let's create the text box. So to create a text box, less than input greater than, and we'll add a placeholder to this text box. Placeholder equals to-do name. Finally, let's add this button. So on a new line, let's type less than button greater than, and inside the button, we'll have the text add. Now let's save, and this creates all the HTML elements that we need. Next, let's write our JavaScript. So first, we're going to create an array to store our to-dos. And then when we click the add button, we're going to get the text from the text box and add it to our array. And finally, we'll console.log the array. Now let's convert these steps into code. Let's create a new array first. Using const, let's name it to-do list, and we'll make it equal to square brackets. So this is an array with no values inside. We also call this an empty array. Next, when we click the button, let's get the value from the text box. So let's go to our button and add an onClick attribute. And then inside here, let's create a function for this. So down here, let's create a function. We'll name it add to-do brackets and curly brackets. And then inside the onClick attribute, we're just going to call this function. Add to-do and brackets. The next step is to get the text in the text box. We can do that using document.querySelector. So to use query selector, we're going to put a class on this input element. So we'll type the class attribute js-name-input, and then in here, document.querySelector, brackets and a string, and we'll type a dot to get a class, and we'll get this class, js-name-input. As a reminder, this gets an element with the class JS-name-input, which is this element, and puts it into our JavaScript. And now let's save this in a variable. So at the start, let's type const input element and make it equal to this result. So now we took this input and put it into our JavaScript. To get the text out, we're going to use a property of the input element called value. So down here, input element dot value. And let's save the value in the text box in a variable so we can use it later. At the front, const name, and we'll make it equal to whatever's in the text box. Before we continue, let's console.log the name to check if this is working. So let's save this JavaScript file, and let's also save this HTML file. We'll go to our browser, and I'll resize it so we can see the console. And now if we type something in the text box, like make dinner, and click add, it will get the text from the text box and then display it in the console. Okay, so it's looking good so far. The next step is to add this name to our to-do list. So we learned how to do this earlier. We can use a method called push. Push will add a value to the end of the array. So let's remove this for now. And at the bottom, we're going to type our array to-do list dot push brackets. And then between the brackets, we're going to add our name here. And now the last step is to console.log the entire array. Console.log to-do list and save. Now let's give it a try. We'll type make dinner in the text box and click add. It will take this text, add it to the array, and then console.log the array. And now we have our to-do list. Let's add another to-do. We'll type wash dishes and click add. Again, it will get the text in the text box and then add it to the array. So now our array has two values, and then we display them in the console. So that's how we create this first version of the to-do list project. Now, one more feature we're going to create is if we add something to our to-do list and click add, it will reset the text box. To do that, let's go into our code and we'll create some new lines. And remember that the value property represents the text in the text box. So to change the text in the text box, we can simply change the value property. So we'll type input element dot value and change it to the empty string. So this will make the text in the text box become empty. If we save and now type something in the text box and click add, it will reset the text in the text box. Let's move on to the second version of the to-do list. So here, when we type something in the text box, like make dinner and click add, it will actually display it on the page. If we type something else, like wash dishes and click add, it will also add it to the page. So how do we take our array and display each value on the page? To do this, we're going to learn another feature of JavaScript called loops. Loops let us run some code over and over, like a loop. So let's go back to our 11 arrays and loops file, and we can close this JavaScript file for now. And we're going to learn loops. So first, let's comment out the previous code by typing /* and at the bottom, */. Let's scroll down and we'll create our first loop. We'll start by creating a variable using the word let, and we'll name this variable I, and we'll make it equal to 1. Next, we're going to type the word while, and then brackets and curly brackets. and then inside these curly brackets, we're going to put some code that the computer will run over and over, just like a loop. Let's put the code console.log I. So this will display the variable I in the console over and over again. Now, obviously, we don't want to loop this forever. So how do we get this loop to stop? We can do that using the round brackets up here. Inside these round brackets, we're going to put some code that results in true or false. For example, we can check if I is less than or equal to 5. So the way this works is that if this code results in true, the loop will keep going over and over. Once this results in false, the loop will stop and it will go to the next line. Now you may notice that this code will never result in false because I is equal to 1 and 1 is always less than or equal to 5. So when does this actually become false and stop the loop? The answer is, inside this loop, we're also going to update this variable I. So we'll type I and we'll make it equal to itself plus 1. So now every time we loop over this code, we're going to increase I by 1. And eventually, I will be greater than 5. This will return false, and it will stop the loop. If we save, and then go back to the tab for this file, and I'll rearrange my windows so we can see the console, this loop makes the computer count from 1 to 5. So let's go over this code step by step to make sure we understand how it works. First, we create a variable I and we make it equal to 1. And then we do a loop. So if this condition is true, the computer will keep running this code over and over again. So the first time it loops, I equals 1, and then it displays 1 in the console, and then we increase I to 2. Now we go back to the top, and we check this code. 2 is less than or equal to 5. This is true, so we're going to run this code again. This time I equals 2, and we display it in the console, and then we increase I to 3. And now 3 is still less than or equal to 5, so this is true, which means we keep running this code. And eventually, this is going to increase I to 6. Once I is 6, this will become false, which will cause the loop to stop, and then we go to the next line. So that's why it counts from 1 to 5, and then it stops at 5. So this is called a while loop. While this condition is true, it will keep running this code over and over again, just like a loop. As soon as this condition is false, it will stop the loop. All right, now that we understand how a while loop works, let's learn the syntax rules. To create a while loop, we type the word while, and then round brackets and curly brackets. The code inside the round brackets is called the loop condition. The code inside the curly brackets is called the loop body. The variable I at the top is called the loop variable. Every time we loop, we're going to increase the loop variable. This is known as the increment step. The increment step makes sure that the loop ends at some point. Without this increment step, the loop would just keep going forever. This is known as an infinite loop. Now remember that I equals I plus 1 has a shortcut. Instead of this, we can just do I plus equals 1. And remember, we actually have an even shorter shortcut for plus equals 1. Instead of this, we can also do I plus plus. So this will increase the value of I by 1 every time, just like before. So those are the three major parts of a loop: the loop variable, the loop condition, and the increment step. Now, each time we run this loop, this is called an iteration. So in this loop, we did 5 iterations. We ran this code 5 times. And lastly, loops create a scope. Any variable that we create between these curly brackets will only exist inside the curly brackets. So that's a while loop. While this condition is true, it will keep running this code over and over again. Once this condition becomes false, it will stop the loop and go to the next line. So in JavaScript, there's actually 2 types of loops. The first type is a while loop, which we just learned. Now we're going to learn another type of loop called a for loop. To create a for loop, we'll create some new lines, and then down here, we'll type for, and brackets and curly brackets. Inside these brackets, we're going to type 3 pieces of code. The first piece of code is a loop variable, which is the same thing as this line up here. So we'll type let I equals 1, and then semicolon, space, and we'll type a second piece of code, which is the loop condition. So here, we'll type I less than equal to 5, and then semicolon and space. And the last piece of code is the increment step, which is this line right here. So we'll type I++. And between these curly brackets, we'll write the code that we want to loop over and over. So let's just type the code console.log I and save. So this for loop does the same thing as the while loop above. It counts from 1 to 5. And if we look at this code, we can see that a for loop is just a shorter version of this while loop. Instead of writing the loop variable condition and increment step separately, we group all of them together at the top. So this loop works the same way. First, we create a loop variable, and then as long as this loop condition is true, we will keep running this code over and over. And every time we run this code, we're also going to increase the loop variable by 1. So now that we learned 2 ways of doing a loop, which one should we use? If we're doing a standard loop, for example, it has a loop variable, a condition, and an increment step every time, it's recommended to use a for loop because a for loop is shorter and more organized than a while loop. However, if it's a non-standard loop, then it might be better to use a while loop. So what's an example of a non-standard loop? So let's say we want to generate random numbers until we get a number that's at least 0.5. To create this loop, we'll create a variable that will store the random number using let random number and make it equal to 0 to start. And then we'll do a while loop, brackets and curly brackets. Now inside the loop condition, we want to keep running this loop until random number is at least 0.5. So we'll check if random number is less than 0.5. Because if it is less than 0.5, we want to keep running this loop until we get a random number that's at least 0.5. And then inside this loop, we're going to generate a random number between 0 and 1, and then save it in the variable up here. So we'll type random number and make it equal to capital M math.random. So if this random number is less than 0.5, it will keep generating random numbers until we get a number that is at least 0.5. So at the bottom, if we console.log random number and save, it will give us a random number that's at least 0.5. So notice that this is a non-standard loop. It doesn't really have a loop variable that we increase every time, and it also doesn't have the increment step. So in this situation, when we have a non-standard loop, it's better to use a while loop because they're a bit more flexible. All right, now that we learned the basics of loops, let's do some practical examples. We're going to learn a technique called looping through an array. This means we're going to go through each value of an array one by one and do something with each value. So first, let's comment out the previous code using /* and */. At the bottom, let's create an array of strings. So we'll create a variable const to-do list equal to an array. And inside this array, we'll have the string make dinner, another string wash dishes, and another string watch YouTube. Now let's take each value in this array and display it in the console. To do that, we're going to run a loop, and this loop is going to count from 0 to the last index in the array. So remember that the index is the position of a value in the array. The first value is index 0, the second value is index 1, third value is index 2, and so on. So below this, let's type for brackets and curly brackets. Inside these brackets, we're going to create the loop variable. So here, we're going to count the indexes. Let index equals 0, semicolon space, and we'll do the loop condition. So we'll keep looping as long as the index is less than or equal to the last index. So remember that the index starts from 0. This means that the last index in an array will be the number of values in the array minus 1, or the array.length minus 1. To do list dot length minus 1. And here we'll add another semicolon, and we'll add the increment step, which is index plus plus. So we'll increase it by 1 every time. Now inside these curly brackets, we can do something for each index of this array. For now, let's just console.log this index and save. So this will count from 0 to 2, which is exactly all the indexes in this array. And now, using this index, we can also access the value at this index. So instead of just the index, here we can do to-do list and then square brackets, and between the brackets, index. This will take whatever the index variable is and access that index in the array. So if the index variable is 0, this will access to-do list index 0, which is the first value. When the index is 1, it will access to-do list index 1, which is the second value, and so on. So for now, let's save the value in a variable using const value and make it equal to-do list bracket index. And now let's console.log the value instead. If we save, this will loop through each index of the array, get the value at each index, and then display each value, which is what we see in the console. So this technique is called looping through an array. We use a loop to go through each value of an array, and then we can do something with each value. Now, I'm going to show you a few shortcuts we can use when looping through an array. Instead of checking if index is less than or equal to to-do-list.length minus 1, we can shorten this to index less than to-do-list.length. So this check does the same thing as before. The loop will stop at index equals length minus 1, but it saves us some typing. Another shortcut is, instead of naming the loop variable index, we can shorten this to I. And we'll shorten this as well, and this as well. And that's why we often name the loop variable I. I means index. Next, we're going to learn a technique that we can combine with looping through an array, called the accumulator pattern. So first, let's comment out the previous code using /* and */. And at the bottom, let's say we have an array of numbers like this. How do we calculate the total of all the numbers in the array? Let's set up this problem. Let's say we have an array of numbers, const nums equals array, and then the numbers 1, 1, and 3. And we want to calculate the total of all the numbers in this array. To calculate the total, we'll learn the accumulator pattern. The first step of the accumulator pattern is to create a variable to store the result. So below this, let's create a variable, const total, and we'll make it equal to 0. And the next step is to loop through this array and update the result. So down here, for brackets and curly brackets, and inside the round brackets, we'll create the loop variable let I, or index, equals 0, semicolon, space, and we'll create the loop condition I less than nums dot length, and then semicolon, and the increment step I plus plus. So as we learned earlier, this loop will go through each index of this array. And now between these curly brackets, first, let's use the index to get each value. So we'll type nums and then square brackets and access the index I. And let's save this in a variable using const num equals this value. And finally, we're going to add each number to the total. We can type total and make it equal to itself plus each number. And remember, we have a shortcut for this, which is plus equals. And finally, since we're changing this total variable, we have to change from const to let. All right, so after this loop, we should have added each number in the array to the total. So at the bottom, let's console.log the total and save, and it will display 5, which is the exact total of all the numbers in this array. So that's the accumulator pattern. We first create a variable to store the result, and then we loop through the array and update the result. So notice that as we loop through the array, we're adding or accumulating the results into this variable. And that's why this is called the accumulator pattern. And we call this variable the accumulator variable. All right, let's do another example using the accumulator pattern. Let's say we're given this array of numbers again, and we want to create a copy of the array where each number is doubled. So if the array is 1, 1, 3, we're going to create a new array with 2, 2, 6. So at the bottom, we'll create some new lines and use the accumulator pattern. The first step is to create a variable to store the result. Let's type const And let's name this nums doubled. And we'll make it equal to an array this time. So notice in the previous example, the accumulator variable was a number. In this example, the accumulator variable is an array. So we can use different types of values to accumulate the result. It all depends on the problem we're trying to solve. So now the next step is to loop through this array and update the result. At the bottom, we'll create a for loop, brackets and curly brackets. Inside the round brackets, we'll create the loop variable let I equals 0, and we'll create the loop condition I less than nums dot length, and then the increment step I plus plus. And now between the curly brackets, we're going to get the number at each index. So const num equals nums square bracket I, and then we're going to update the result. So down here, we're going to add this number doubled to this array. So remember, to add a value to an array, we can use the method push. So we'll type nums doubled dot push brackets, and we're going to add to this array the number num multiplied by 2. And now at the bottom, let's console.log the result, nums doubled, and save. So this second loop will create an array where each number is doubled. So that's how we solve this example. All right, now that we understand how to loop through an array and the accumulator pattern, let's go back and we'll create the second version of our to-do list. So when we add something to the list, it will appear on the page. Let's go to our code editor and we'll open 11todolist.html, and we're also going to open the JavaScript file. So it's this one, and for the video, I'm going to drag it to the bottom of my code editor so that I can see the files side by side. So I'll close this for now, and I'll rearrange my windows a bit. Let's open the tab for this project. So we'll review what we have so far. We can click in this text box and type a to-do like make dinner and click add, and it will add this to-do to this array, which is this array right here. We can type another to-do like wash dishes and click add, and it will add it to the end of the array. So now that we have this array of to-dos, we want to display it on the page. To do that, we're going to loop through this array, and we're going to create some HTML code for each to-do, and then put that code on the web page using the DOM. So first, let's loop through this array. To make this easier, let's make a copy of this array. So right-click, copy, and then here, we'll remove this and right-click and paste. So this will give us some default values to work with. So at the top, let's loop through this array using a for loop. So we'll type for brackets and curly brackets. And then inside the round brackets, we're going to create the loop variable let I or index equal 0, semicolon, and the loop condition I less than to-do list dot length, semicolon, and then the increment step I plus plus. So this will loop through each index of this array. And then inside the curly brackets, let's get the string for each index. So we'll create a variable to save it, const to-do, and we'll make it equal to do list, square brackets, and I. And now for each to do, we're going to create some HTML code. So we'll create a new line and create a variable const HTML and make it equal, and we'll create some HTML code using this to do, using a template string. And then inside, we'll create a paragraph element. So less than p greater than, and then less than /p greater than. Inside this paragraph, we're going to insert this to do. So we'll type $ and curly brackets and to do. All right, so now we're looping through this array, and for each to do, we created some HTML code. And now we're going to combine all of this HTML code together and put it on the web page. To combine this HTML together, we're going to use the accumulator pattern. So at the top of the loop, we'll create a variable to store the result, let to do list capital HTML, and we'll make it equal to the empty string at the start. And then as we loop through the array, we're going to add this HTML to the variable up here. So let's create a new line, and we'll do to do list capital HTML plus equals HTML to combine all of this HTML code together. So now after the loop, let's console.log to do list HTML to see what we get. If we save, we took this array of strings, generated paragraph elements for each string, and then combined them all together. So now that we have all this HTML, we can put it on the page using the DOM. So first, let's create an element where we can put this HTML. So inside the HTML file, after the button, we're going to create a different type of element called a div element. So we'll type less than div greater than. So the div element represents a container. Its purpose is to contain other elements inside, like paragraphs, buttons, and even other divs. So in this situation, we can't actually use a paragraph element because in HTML, we cannot have a paragraph inside another paragraph. So that's why we have to use a div element here. For now, let's put some text inside this element so we can learn more about it. We'll type text and save. So like the paragraph element, the div element is a block element. That means it will take up an entire line by itself. And that's why it appears below the text box and the button. Now, one difference between a div and a paragraph is that a paragraph adds extra space above and below the paragraph, while a div does not add any extra space above or below. So it doesn't have any default styling. All right, so now that we learned the div, let's put this HTML code inside this div. First, we need to get this element into our JavaScript. And to do that, we'll add a class to this element, class equals js-to-do-list. And then down here, let's scroll down, and we'll put this div element inside our JavaScript. We can do that using document.querySelector, brackets and a string, and we'll type a dot to select a class, and we'll select the class js-to-do-list. So this will get this div element and put it inside our JavaScript. And then every HTML element has a property called .inner capital HTML, which controls the HTML inside this element. And now to put the to-do list HTML into this div element, we're going to make the inner HTML equal to the to-do list HTML. And now let's save this file and also save the HTML file. So this code will take the HTML that we created using the loop and put it into the div element. And that's how we make them show up on the page. So now let's try adding another to-do. We'll type watch YouTube and click add. And unfortunately, this new to-do doesn't show up on the page. And that's because when we click add, it will run this add to-do function and update the list. But we didn't actually update the HTML on the page. So to update the HTML, we need to run all this code again every time we add a to-do. So let's create a function for this code so we can reuse it. So at the top, we'll create a function, and let's name this render to-do list, brackets and curly brackets. So the word render means to display something on the page. So we'll put all of this code into this function. So we can delete this curly bracket, and then at the end, we'll type a closed curly bracket. And let's reformat this code by selecting these lines and then press Tab to add an indent. So now let's use this function. At the start, we'll display this to-do list on the page. So we'll call this function by typing render to-do list and brackets. And then let's scroll down. Every time we add a to-do to the list, we're also going to display the list again. So at the bottom, render to-do list and brackets again. So if we save, at the start, it will display the list on the page. And then if we add to the list, like watch YouTube and click add, it will add it to the list and also display it on the page. So that's how we create the second version of the to-do list project. By the way, if we scroll up to the render to-do list function, this technique is called generating the HTML. Instead of writing all the HTML by hand up here, we looped through an array and we generated the HTML using JavaScript. So when creating websites with JavaScript, we usually follow a 3-step process. First, we save the data. In this case, we saved our data as an array. Next, we use the data to generate the HTML, which we did here. And finally, we make the website interactive, which we'll do later in this lesson. This is the main idea of JavaScript, and we follow this overall process when creating websites. The rock, paper, scissors project from the previous lessons was a bit different because all the HTML we needed was already there. We just had to modify it with JavaScript. So this process we're using for the to-do list is one step above what we did for rock, paper, scissors. We need to generate some HTML. And this is the standard process for creating websites. We're going to use this process for the to-do list and later the Amazon project, as well as websites that you build beyond this course. Let's take a break before continuing with the rest of this lesson. Here are some exercises that will help you practice what we learned so far. Now let's create the final version of the to-do list. We'll go back to supersimple.dev, and then here we'll scroll down and we'll create this final version. So in this version, we can type a to-do like make dinner, and we can also add a due date. And when we click add, each to-do will now have a name and a due date. And they will also have a delete button that we can click to remove it from the list. So let's build this out one feature at a time. We'll start by creating this delete button. We'll go into our code, and remember, we're generating the HTML for the to-do list. So for each value in the array, we create a paragraph element. So to add a delete button, we just have to add a delete button inside here. So inside the paragraph, we'll create a less than, button, greater than, and then less than / button greater than. And then inside this button, we'll put the text delete. Let's save. And in the console, you'll see that the HTML we generated now has a delete button inside the paragraph. And that's what shows up on the page. Next, we're going to reformat this HTML to make it a little easier to read. So we'll create some new lines here and at the end. And let's put the content of the paragraph on its own line, like this. And also put the delete button on its own line. So remember that template strings have a feature called multi-line strings. So this is perfect for writing HTML code. The last step in the process is to make the website interactive. So next, let's make our delete button do something when we click it. To do that, we use the onClick attribute as usual. So inside this button, we're going to add an onClick attribute equals double quotes. And then inside these double quotes, we can run some JavaScript when we click this button. So this works the exact same way as what we've been doing so far in this course. The only difference now is that here we're generating this HTML using JavaScript. Okay, so when we click one of these delete buttons, we want to remove this to-do from the list. Earlier in this lesson, we learned how to remove a value from an array using a method called splice. So inside this onClick attribute, we're going to type the to-do list dot splice and brackets. So splice takes two numbers. The first number is the index that we want to remove. So if we click this delete button, how do we know which index to remove? Well, if we look at our loop up here, we already have the index. It's this variable I. So we're going to insert I into this string. And we can do that by typing dollar, curly brackets, and I. Now splice also takes another number. So we'll type comma, and the second number is how many values we want to remove. So here, we just want to remove one value at this index. And finally, because we updated the to-do list, we need to display the list again on the page. To display the list, we can use this function, render to-do list. So down here, we're going to type render to-do list and brackets. Now, if we save, you can see that in the generated HTML, when we click the first delete button, it will remove the value at index 0, which is the first value. If we click the second button, it will remove the value at index 1, which is the second value. So we're basically generating all this HTML using a loop. So now if we click this delete button, it will remove it from the list and then display the updated list on the page. So that's how we create the delete button. Next, let's go back to supersimple.dev, and we're going to create the due date feature. So first, let's create this date selector in our HTML. We'll go to our HTML file, and then under the text box, we're going to add another input element. So less than, input, greater than. And to make it a date selector, input elements have an attribute called type. So this attribute determines what kind of input it is. If the type is text, which is the default value, it's going to be a text box. Now, if we change the type to date and save, it's going to create a date selector. Now let's go back into our JavaScript code. And first, we're going to scroll up. And remember that right now, our to-do list is just an array of strings. But this time, each to-do is also going to have a due date. So how do we group the name and the due date together? We can do that using an object. So here, instead of just a string, we're going to create an object. And we'll give it a name property, which is make dinner, and we'll give it a due date property. And we'll make the due date a string. So you can type whatever date you have on the page. For me, it's 2022-12-22. And I'll end this object with a curly bracket, and I'll turn this second to do into an object as well. So open curly bracket, name, and due date. 2022-12-22, and closed curly bracket. Now that each to-do is an object, we need to update the rest of our code. Let's scroll down, and we'll start with the render function. So here, inside the loop, each to-do is no longer just a string, it's an object. So let's change this variable name to to-do object to make it more clear. And now we need to get the name and due date out of this object. So we'll type const name equals to-do object dot name and const due date equals to-do object dot due date. And now instead of inserting to-do, which no longer exists, we're going to insert the name. And we're also going to insert the due date. If we save, now each to-do will also display a due date. Before we continue, we're going to review a shortcut we can use with objects called destructuring. So here, you'll notice the variable name is the same as the property name. We actually have a shortcut for this using const curly brackets name equals to-do object. So this is called destructuring. This takes the name property out of the object and puts it in a variable also called name. And this is a shortcut for this line up here. So we can comment out this line. We can also use multiple properties in this shortcut. To also take the due date out of the object, we can just add a comma and due date. So this will do the same thing as this line of code, and we can comment this out. If we save, everything still works. Next, let's scroll down, and we're going to update our add to do function. So this time, when we click the add button, we're going to get the name and the due date and put it into our list. So let's get the due date out of this date selector first. We can do that using the DOM like we did here. So let's add a class attribute so we can get it using query selector js-due-date-input. And then down here, let's create a variable const date input element and make it equal to document dot query selector and a string dot and then the class we want to select, which is this class, js-do-date-input. So this will get the date selector element and put it into our JavaScript. And now below this, let's get the due date out of the element. We can do that using the value property again. So let's create a variable first, const due date, and we'll make it equal to the date input element dot value. So this will get the date that we selected and save it in this variable. And now when we add a to-do to our list, instead of just a name, we're going to add an object. So open curly bracket, we'll add a name property, and the value will be the name variable up here. So name, and then comma, and a due date property. And the value will be this due date variable up here. So due date, and then a closed curly bracket. And remember that objects also have a shortcut for this. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can just type it out once, like this. This will do the same thing as this line above. Same thing with the second line. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can just type a comma and type it out once. This is called the shorthand property syntax. So these two lines do the same thing as these lines above. So we can comment this out using double slash and double slash. So that's all the code that we needed to update. Now let's save our JavaScript file, and we'll also save our HTML file. And let's go to our project. We'll add a new to-do like watch YouTube and select a date and click add and scroll down. You can see that it added our new to-do with a name, due date, and a delete button. If we click this delete button, it will remove that to-do. If we click this one, it will also remove the correct to-do. And that's actually all the functionality that we need for this project. So let's go into our code, and we're going to clean up by removing the console.log here and the console.log up here. And save. Finally, let's add CSS to our project to make it look like the final design. We'll go into our code editor and scroll to the top. And instead of writing all the CSS in here, let's put the CSS in a separate file, just like our JavaScript. So we'll click here to show our files, and then find the styles folder. And we'll click the styles folder and click this icon to create a new file inside. And we'll name this file 11-to-do-list.css and press enter. And for the video, I'm going to take this CSS file and put it at the bottom of my code editor so I can see these files side by side. And now I'll click here to close it, and we'll load this CSS into our HTML. To do that, we can use a link element. So inside the head section, let's type less than link greater than, and we're going to give it two attributes. Rel equals style sheet, and href equals the file that we want to load. So we created this in the styles folder. So we'll type styles and then a slash to go into the folder, and we'll load this file, 11-to-do-list.css. to-do-list.css and save. Now let's style our project one by one until it matches the final design. We'll start with the text on the page. We're going to change the font. So in here, let's type body, curly brackets, and then we'll change the font dash family colon Arial and save. So that looks pretty good. Now let's work on styling the to-do list. First, let's add some more to-dos to the list. So we'll type watch YouTube, and then we'll select a date and click add. And we're going to learn how to style our list to look like this. So notice that this list creates a sort of grid. We're going to create this grid using a feature called CSS Grid. So let's go into our HTML first. We're going to add a class to this div element so we can style it. To-do-grid. And let's save. And inside our CSS, we're going to style this class using dot to-do-grid and curly brackets. And to turn this into a grid, we're going to use the property display and grid. And we're going to add another property called grid-template-columns. So this basically sets how many columns are in our grid. The number of values that we give it is the number of columns. For example, if we give it 200 pixels, 150 pixels, and 100 pixels, this will create 3 columns in the grid. The first column will be 200 pixels, the second column will be 150 pixels, and the third column will be 100 pixels. And now each element inside this div will go into the columns. So the first element will go in the first column, second element will go in the second column, and the third element will go in the third column. If we have more than 3 elements, it will wrap around and create a new row. So let's save. And unfortunately, that didn't quite work. And that's because if we go back to our JavaScript, remember that each to-do is one paragraph element. So this entire to-do with the name, due date, and delete button will go inside the first column, and then the next entire to-do will go inside the second column. But what we actually want is for the name to go in column 1, due date column 2, and delete button column 3. To do this, we're going to separate this element into 3 elements so that each element will go into each column. So instead of one paragraph, let's actually use a div element. So less than, div greater than, and less than slash div greater than. And in between, we'll insert the name. So the reason we used a div element is because div elements don't have any default styling, so it's a little easier to style with CSS. For the due date, let's also create a div element. So less than div, and then at the end, less than slash div greater than. And finally, for the delete button, we already have an element. So let's just reformat these lines. We'll select these lines and then press Shift-Tab to remove the indent. Let's remove the extra line, and we basically separated each to-do into 3 elements. If we save, now the grid is working because this element goes into the first column, this element goes into the second column, and the button goes into the third column. And that's how we lay out these elements in a grid, like the final design. Next, let's also lay out the inputs and the add button in a grid. we'll go to our HTML, and let's put these three elements in a div so we can use grid. So we'll create a less than div greater than, and then inside, let's remove this, and we'll add it at the end, less than slash div, and let's reformat these lines by selecting them and then press tab to add an indent. And now let's make this div a grid as well. Let's go back to our CSS and we'll add a class to this div. Class equals, let's call it to-do dash input dash grid. And instead of writing all the CSS again, we can use a feature of CSS. So here, we're going to type a comma and enter. So when we type a comma, we can style multiple classes at the same time. So we're also going to style dot to-do dash input dash grid. If we save the CSS file, and let's also save the HTML file, now the input and the add button are also laid out in the same grid. Next, let's adjust the spacing inside our grid. So grid has some properties for this. We'll go to our CSS, press enter, and we'll use the property column dash gap. So this sets the spacing between the columns of the grid. So let's make this colon 10 pixels and save. So now it will add 10 pixels between each column. Let's add some spacing between the rows as well. And grid has another property for this. Row dash gap colon 10 pixels and save. So that will add 10 pixels of space between the rows. Now notice it didn't add space between these two rows. And that's because these two are separate grids. This is the to-do list, and this is the to-do input grid. So to add space between them, we're just going to use margin. At the bottom, we'll style dot to-do dash input dash grid, and we'll just add some margin under this grid. So margin dash bottom colon 10 pixels and save. All right, now let's move on to styling the inputs and the buttons. We'll start with the inputs first. Let's add a class so we can style them. Here, let's add a class name dash input. And down here, let's also add another class due dash date dash input. Let's save. And now inside our CSS, we'll style both of these inputs. So we'll style dot name dash input curly brackets. And first, let's make the text bigger, like the final design. We'll set the font dash size colon 15 pixels and save. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now let's add spacing on the inside of this input. So we'll add padding 6 pixels and save. And that looks pretty good. Let's move on to the due date input. So we actually want the same styles as the name input. So again, we can use that feature of CSS. We'll type a comma and then dot due dash date dash input. So now these styles will be applied to this class and to this class. Let's save. And that looks pretty good to me. Let's move on and style the buttons. We'll go into our HTML and find the add button. Let's add a class so we can style it. And we'll use add dash to-do dash button. Let's save. And then inside our CSS, we'll style that class using dot add dash to do dash button curly brackets. And let's start with the background color. We'll set the background dash color colon green and save. Now let's do the text color, color colon white and save. Now let's remove the border around our button using border colon none, save. And let's make the text a little bigger. So we'll do font dash size colon 15 pixels and save. And the last thing we'll add is when we put our mouse over the button, it turns into this pointer icon. We can do that using cursor colon pointer and save. Next, let's style the delete buttons. So these delete buttons are created in our JavaScript. We'll go into our JavaScript file, and then here, let's add a class to each of the delete buttons so we can style them. So we'll add class equals double quotes and then delete dash to do dash button. Let's save. And then inside our CSS, at the bottom, we'll style dot delete dash to do dash button curly brackets. And let's start with the background color. So we'll set background dash color colon. And for this design, I use the color dark red and save. So that will style our delete buttons. Now let's change the text color to white. So we'll use color colon white and save. Now let's remove the border using border colon none, save. And let's also make the text bigger using font dash size colon 15 pixels. Save. Let's add this pointer icon using cursor colon pointer. Save. And let's add some padding at the top and bottom of the button. So we'll add padding dash top colon 10 pixels and padding dash bottom colon 10 pixels and save. So that's all the styles we need for the delete button. And we can also close the console to see the entire list. However, now we have another problem, which is this text and this button are not vertically aligned in the center. To vertically align in the center, we're going to go back to the grid styles. So we'll scroll up to the to-do grid, and CSS Grid has another property for vertical alignment, and that is align dash items colon center to vertically align in the center. If we save, now the text is aligned with the button. But now we have a new problem. Our add button is no longer stretching to be the same as the inputs. So by default, align items is stretch. That's why this button stretches to match the inputs. And now that we changed it to align center, it's no longer going to stretch. So to solve this problem, we just have to make this grid stretch. So down here in the to-do input grid styles, we'll change align dash items back to stretch and save. And that will cause this grid at the top to stretch vertically again. And that's it. That's all the styling that we need. And now we finished this to-do list project. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn more details about arrays and loops. So I'm going to put this back in the same window, and I'll rearrange this window. And now let's go back to 11 arrays and loops.html, and we'll open the tab for that file. And we can also close these other files for now. And first, let's comment out the previous code using /* and at the bottom, */. And we'll scroll down and save. The first detail we're going to learn is that arrays are references. So in the object lesson, we learned that objects are references. Arrays work the same way. So for example, if we create an array, const array1 equals the array 1, 2, 3, this variable doesn't actually contain the values 1, 2, 3. This array is saved somewhere in the computer's memory, and this variable only contains a reference that points to where this array is in memory. And that means if we create a copy of this variable, const array2 equals array1, array2 doesn't contain a copy of the values. It actually just contains a copy of the reference. So now both of these variables are pointing to the same array. So if we did array2.push 4, and then we console.log array1, and we console.log array2, and save, it will show us that even though we added 4 to array2, array1 and 2 were both modified. And that's because arrays are references. So both of these point to the same array in memory. To avoid this behavior, we can create a copy of the values in the array using a method called slice. So here, if we did array1.slice instead, this will make a copy of the values in array1. And now these two variables point to two different arrays. If we save, now you'll see that this line only affected array2. The second detail we're going to learn is a shortcut called destructuring. So at the bottom here, let's create a new array, const array3 equals the array 1, 2, 3. And let's say we want to get the first value and the second value out of this array. One way to do this is to use the index like this. Another way is to use a shortcut called destructuring. So here, we're going to replace this with square brackets. And now we can type some variable names. If we type first value, it will take the first value and save it in a variable called first value. If we type comma and second value, it will take the second value and save it in this variable. So this is an easier way to get values out of an array and save them inside a variable. Next, we're going to learn more details about loops. So loops have two features called break and continue. Break lets us exit a loop early. For example, let's create some new lines, and let's create a loop that counts from 1 to 10. So as usual, we can use a for loop. Let I equals 1, I less than or equal to 10, and I plus plus. And we'll console.log I. and save. So this will count from 1 to 10. So now let's say that when I is 8, we want to stop this loop early. So first, let's check if I is equal to 8. If it is equal to 8, we're going to stop this loop by typing break and semicolon. If we save, once this reaches 8, break will cause this loop to stop. And now it only counts up to 8. So that's the break feature of a loop. It lets us stop a loop early. The next feature is called continue. Continue lets us skip one iteration of the loop, or one run of the loop. For example, let's say we want to skip the number 3. So at the top, we can check if I is equal to 3, and if it is, we can use the code continue. This will skip the rest of this code and go back up to the top of the loop and do I equals 4. If we save, this will skip 3 in the loop. So continue lets us skip one iteration of the loop. So now let's say that we want to skip a number if it's divisible by 3. Divisible by 3 means the number can be divided evenly into 3. For example, 3 and 6 are both divisible by 3, but 7 is not divisible by 3 because there's one remaining. This is called the remainder, and we can calculate the remainder using the remainder operator, which looks like this. So to check if a number is divisible by 3, we can check if the remainder is 0. So here, we're going to replace this with I remainder 3, and we'll check if the remainder is equal to 0. If we save, this will skip 3 and 6 because they're both divisible by 3. Next, let's use continue in a while loop. So at the end here, we'll create some new lines. And let's say we want to count from 1 to 10 using a while loop. So we'll create a loop variable, let I equals 1, and we'll create a while loop, I less than or equal to 10, curly brackets, and the increment step, I plus plus. And inside the loop, we'll just console.log I and save. So this will count from 1 to 10 again. And let's say we want to not count numbers that are divisible by 3. So 3, 6, and 9. So at the top here, we can check if I remainder 3 is equal to 0 and curly brackets, and we might just try to do continue. However, in a while loop, continue will actually skip the increment step, and this will cause an infinite loop. So when using continue in a while loop, we have to do this increment step manually. So before continue, we have to do I plus plus to avoid an infinite loop. If we save, it will skip the numbers that are divisible by 3, which is 3, 6, and 9. So remember, in a while loop, if we use continue, always do the increment step manually. In a for loop, however, the increment step is done automatically after every iteration. All right, the last detail we're going to learn is how to use loops with functions. So let's say we have an array of numbers, and we want to create a copy of this array where each number is doubled. So we already have the code for this. We can scroll up, and the code for this is here. So let's actually make a copy of this code from before. We'll right-click, copy, and scroll down here, And at the bottom, right-click and paste. At the top, let's create an array called nums. So const nums equals array and 1, 1, and 3. If we save, this will create an array where each number is doubled. Now, what if we wanted to use this loop on a different array other than 1, 1, and 3? We can do that using a function. So let's create a function around this loop. We'll create function. Let's name it double array, brackets, and curly bracket. We'll remove the closed curly bracket, and at the bottom, we'll add it back. And we'll select these lines and press tab. So now, instead of doing this loop on the same array every time, we can turn this into a parameter. So at the top here, we'll create a parameter called nums. And we're going to delete this line. And we're going to loop over this parameter instead. So at the bottom, we can call our function using double array and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to save an array into nums. So square bracket, 1, 1, and 3. If we save, this will do the same thing as before. But now because it's in a function, we can use this loop with any array, not just 1, 1, and 3. So at the end, we can do double array, brackets, and an array 2, 2, 5 this time, and save. And it will create an array where these numbers are doubled. So using a function, we can reuse this loop for any value. Another feature of using a function with a loop is that we can break out of this loop using a return instead. So first, let's actually use a return in this function. Instead of console.log, we're going to return nums doubled. And here, we're going to console.log the result. Console.log and console.log. And save. So this does the same thing as before, except we're returning the result and console.logging outside of the function. Now let's say that if we see the number 0, we want to stop this loop early. To do that, we can click here and check if num is equal to 0. And if it is, we can break out of this loop. Now, when we're inside a function, we can also use a return statement to break out of this loop. So we can also do return nums doubled. So a return statement will end this function immediately. So this is another way of ending the loop. So down here, if we add the number 0 and then 5 and save, you'll notice that the loop stops when we see the number 0. So return is another way of breaking out of a loop when it's inside a function. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned about arrays, which represent a list of values. We learned about loops, which let us run some code over and over, just like a loop. We learned a technique we can use with loops called the accumulator pattern, and we used it to create a to-do list project. We learned that arrays are references and the destructuring shortcut, and we learned more features of loops, like break, continue, and using loops inside a function. Here are some exercises to help you practice arrays and loops. In this lesson, we're going to learn some advanced features of functions, and we're going to use them to improve our previous projects. First, let's create a new file for this lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click here to show our files, and click here to create a new file. And we'll name this 12-advanced-functions.html and press enter. Now let's copy 11 arrays and loops into this file. So we'll click here, Control A or Command A, and then right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. And we can close this for now. And let's prepare this file for this lesson. So we'll scroll up and change the title to Advanced Functions. And let's remove all the JavaScript code from before. And now let's save and open this file in the browser by right-clicking, Open with Live Server. And let's also open the console on this page. So we'll right-click, Inspect, and open the console. And now we can close the previous tabs, as well as the previous files. And now we're ready to begin. So first, we're going to review how to use functions. Inside the script element, let's create a function using the word function. We'll give it a name, greeting, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside the function, we'll type the code console.log the string hello. So this is a function, and it lets us reuse code. To run the code inside this function, we can type the function name, which is greeting, and then brackets. If we save, this line of code will run the code inside the function and display hello. This is known as calling the function or running the function. So now that we understand functions, we're going to learn an advanced feature of functions, which is functions are values. So we learned many types of values in this course, like numbers, strings, and booleans. And we can save a value in a variable. For example, let's create some new lines, and we'll create a variable const num equal 2. So this will save the value 2 inside the variable num. Now functions are also values, and this means just like a number, we can save a function inside a variable. So let's give it a try. We'll create a new line and type const function 1, and we'll make this equal to a function this time. So we'll just type function and a name, greeting, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside the function, we'll type console.log the string hello 2. And we'll put a semicolon at the end, since we're saving in a variable. So this variable now contains a function. We're using the exact same syntax as before, except we're just taking this function and saving it in a variable, because functions are values. So now that this function is inside this variable, let's actually console.log it. So we'll console.log function 1 and save. And this will show us that the variable function 1 actually contains this function. Now on a new line, we can also do console.log and check the type of function 1 and save. and it will tell us that the type of this variable is a function. So as you can see, a function is just another type of value, and we can save it in a variable. We can also run the function inside this variable by typing the variable name function1, and because this contains a function, we can actually just call it using brackets. So this will run the code inside this function. If we save, it displays hello 2. Now let's do some cleanup in this code. In JavaScript, as long as there's a way to access a function, this function name is not needed. So here, we can access this function using this variable. So this function name is not needed, and we can actually just delete it, like this. And now this is called an anonymous function, which means a function without a name. Now, an interesting thing to know is that the function syntax that we've been using this entire course up here is actually a shortcut for this code. Now, even though this syntax uses var, and we usually don't recommend var, this syntax actually has a couple advantages. Number one, it's easier to read, and number two, it gives us a feature called hoisting, which means we can call this function greeting brackets before we create it in the code. So using hoisting, we don't have to worry about what order we write this code. Hoisting doesn't work when we create our function and save it in a variable like this. So in JavaScript, functions are values, and just like any other value, we can save it in a variable. Now let's think, what else can we do with a value? Well, we can save a value in an object. For example, let's scroll down and create some new lines, and we'll create an object. Const object1 equals curly brackets. And inside this object, we'll have a property num with the value 2. So this saves the number 2 inside this object. Now, because functions are values, we can also save a function inside this object. So we'll type comma, and then a property fun, colon, and we'll create a function this time. Function greeting brackets and curly brackets, and inside we'll type console.log the string hello 3. So this saves a function inside this object under the property fun. Now to access this function, we just use the dot notation as normal. So object1 dot fun. And because this value is a function, we can call it using brackets. If we save, this will run the code inside the function and display hello 3. So remember, this is called a method when we have a function saved inside an object. Again, as long as there's a way to access this function, for example, using object1.fun, then we don't need this function name. So we'll delete it and use an anonymous function. Now let's think, what else can we do with a value? We can pass a value into a function. For example, down here, let's create a function display brackets and curly brackets, and we'll give this function a parameter. So in here, we'll create a parameter and name it param. And inside the function, we can use a parameter just like a variable. So we'll console.log the param. And then down here, let's call this function using display brackets and 2. This will take the value 2, save it inside param, and then we can use it just like a variable. If we save, this will display 2 in the console. So this is known as passing a value into a function. Now, because functions are values, we can also pass a function into a function. So let's give it a try. Down here, we'll create a new function run brackets and curly brackets. And this function will also have a parameter. Let's call it param. And down here, we'll call this function run brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to give it a function this time. So we'll type function brackets and curly brackets. And inside the function, we'll type console.log the string hello 4. So this will take this function and save it inside param. And now up here, we can use param just like a variable. So we can type param, and because param contains a function, we can actually just call it using brackets. If we save, this code will run the function that we created down here and display hello 4. So this is called passing a function into another function. The function that we're passing in is called a callback function or a callback. So to summarize, functions are values. Anything we can do with a value, we can also do with a function. Now let's do some practical examples using functions as values. We're going to learn a feature of JavaScript called setTimeout. SetTimeout allows us to run a function in the future. First, we'll comment out the previous code using /* and at the bottom, */. And let's create some new lines. And we're going to type the code set capital T time out. So setTimeout is a built-in function. So we can type brackets to call this function. Now setTimeout takes 2 parameters. Inside these brackets, the first parameter is a function that we want to run in the future. Let's create a function, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside this function, let's type console.log the string timeout. So here we're using a function as a value and we're passing it into another function. At the end, we'll type a comma and we'll give setTimeout a second parameter. The second parameter is how long to wait before running this function. So this is a number in milliseconds. 1000 milliseconds is equal to 1 second. So if we type 3000 milliseconds, this is equal to 3 seconds. So setTimeout will wait for 3 seconds and then call this function. If we save, after 3 seconds, it's going to display timeout in the console. So that's setTimeout. We give it a function and it will call this function after a certain amount of time. So now we're going to learn an important concept called asynchronous code. So after setTimeout, let's type console.log the string next line and save. So notice that it displays next line first, and then after 3 seconds, it displays timeout. So what's happening here? Why are they reversed? setTimeout sets up a timer, and after 3 seconds, it will call this function. However, it doesn't actually wait for the 3 seconds to finish. It just sets up the timer and immediately goes to the next line. So that's why this line is displayed first. So this is called asynchronous code. Asynchronous code means the computer won't wait for this line to finish before going on to the next line. So for set timeout, it'll just set up the timer and then immediately go to the next line. Synchronous code, on the other hand, means the computer will wait for one line to finish before going to the next line. So all the code we've written in this course so far has been synchronous code. In addition, all the code inside this function is also synchronous code. So if we added console.log the string timeout2 and save, the code inside the function will still run line by line. It will wait for each line to finish before going to the next line. And after 3 seconds, it will display timeout followed by timeout2. So don't worry, all the code that we normally write will be synchronous code. It will run line by line as usual. The only time that code becomes asynchronous is when we use certain features of JavaScript, like set timeout. So set timeout is the only part that is asynchronous. Now, the advantage of set timeout being asynchronous is that it doesn't block our code for 3 seconds, waiting for this timer to finish. It just sets up the timer in the background and then goes to the next line of code. So this allows our code to do other things while this timer is running in the background. And this is similar to real life. If you set up a timer on your alarm clock, you're not going to stop and wait for the timer to finish. You're going to go and do something else. Asynchronous code is the exact same concept. Next, we're going to learn a similar function to set timeout called setInterval. So at the bottom, let's type the code set capital I interval, and setInterval is another built-in function, so we can call it using brackets. And setInterval takes the same 2 parameters as setTimeout. The first parameter is a function that we want to run in the future. So let's type function, brackets, and curly brackets, and inside we'll type console.log the string interval. Now let's add a comma, and the second parameter is also a number in milliseconds. So we'll type 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. So setInterval will run this function 3 seconds in the future, but this time it will keep running the function every 3 seconds. If we save in the console, every 3 seconds it will run the function and display interval. So setInterval is also asynchronous. Below it, if we type console.log the string next line 2 and save, it will set up the interval and then immediately go to the next line and display next line 2. So that's setInterval. We give it a function and it will keep running this function after a certain period of time. So now let's do a project using what we learned so far. Let's go to our browser and we'll create a new tab at the top. And here, let's type supersimple.dev/projects/advanced-functions and press enter. So this is basically the rock, paper, scissors game that we created earlier, except this time it has an extra button called autoplay. If we click this button, every second the computer will play by itself. So this feature will help us practice using setInterval. So first, let's make a copy of the project files. We'll go into our code editor and click this icon to show our files. And let's make a copy of 10 rock, paper, scissors for this lesson. So we'll right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And I'll stop this for now. So here, we're going to change the name by right-clicking, rename. We'll remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, we'll change it to 12 and press enter. And let's also make a copy of the JavaScript and CSS files. So we'll click this file and right-click, copy, and then click the folder, right-click, paste, and we'll rename this file. Right-click, rename, remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, change it to 12, and press enter. And let's also make a copy of the CSS file. Select it, right-click, copy, click the folder, right-click, and paste. And right-click, rename, remove copy, and at the front, change it to 12, and press enter. Now let's scroll down to 12 rock, paper, scissors, and I'll close this for now. And inside the head, let's change this to load 12 rock, paper, scissors. And we'll scroll to the bottom. And here, instead of the lesson 10 file, we'll load the lesson 12 JavaScript file. Let's save, and we'll open this in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. So now we're ready to begin. Let's go back to supersimple.dev. And the first thing we're going to create is this auto play button. So beside the reset score button, which is here, we're going to create a new button, less than, button, greater than, and inside we'll have the text auto play. Let's save and go back to our tab. And now we have this button. So next, let's style this button with CSS. So we'll give it a class equals auto-play-button, and save. And now let's open the CSS file. I'm going to take this file and then drag it to the bottom so I can see it side by side. So I'll close this for now and rearrange this a little bit. And then down here, and we're going to style the auto play button. So let's just make the style the same as the reset score button. So in the CSS, we'll scroll down to the reset score button styles. So we'll add a comma at the end and type dot auto dash play dash button. So now these styles will apply to the class reset score button and the auto play button. If we save, now we styled our project. So next, let's make this button interactive. So at the top here, we'll add an onClick attribute. And then in here, we're going to run some JavaScript code. Let's actually create a function so we can separate the JavaScript into its own file. So we'll run a function called auto-play and brackets. So now let's save. And right now, this function doesn't exist. So we have to create this function in the JavaScript file. So for me, the file is right here. I'll select it and then drag it down here so I can see it side by side. So let's scroll down, and I'm going to create it just above the play game function. So here, we'll create some new lines and type function auto play, brackets and curly brackets. And now inside this function, we want to play the game every second. So we can use set interval to run some code every second. So let's type set interval brackets, and inside the brackets, we'll give it a function that we want to run. So brackets and curly brackets. And then at the end, let's type a comma, and we'll give it 1000. So this means it will run this function every 1000 milliseconds, or 1 second. And now inside this function, we're going to automatically play the game. And to play the game, we can use this function right here, play game. So here, we'll type play game brackets. Now we need to provide this function with a player move. And remember, we have another function, pick computer move, which will give us a random move. So above this line, let's create a variable const player move, and we'll make it equal, and we'll pick a random move using pick computer move and brackets. And finally, we'll take this move that we picked and pass it in to this function. So player move. So now when we click this button, it should play the game every second. Let's save and click autoplay, and it works. The computer is playing against itself every second. So now let's make this button stop playing when we click it again. So at the top, let's create a variable to keep track of whether or not we're playing. So we use let is auto playing, and at the start, we'll make it equal to false and save. And now inside this function, we'll check using an if statement, brackets and curly brackets. And inside this condition, let's check if we're not playing. So not is auto playing. So if we're not playing, then we want to start playing the game, which is this code down here. So let's select this code and then right click, cut, and in here, right click and paste. And also, after we start playing the game, we're going to change this variable to true. So is auto playing, and we'll make it equal to true, because now we are auto playing. So now let's add the else branch to this statement. Else, curly brackets. So now we need to stop this interval. So how do we do that? The answer is that setInterval actually returns a number, and this number is like an ID. We can use this ID to stop the interval. So at the front, let's create a variable to save this ID. Const interval ID and equals. However, there's another problem here. Every time we run the function, we're going to get a different ID. So in order to save the ID from last time, we need to put this variable outside the function. So let's select this and remove it for now. And we'll scroll up. And here, we'll create the variable let interval ID. And we'll leave it undefined to start. And now down here, we're going to save the return value into this variable by typing interval ID equals setInterval. And now at the bottom, we're going to use the interval ID to stop the interval. Let's scroll down, and to stop an interval, we can use a function called clearInterval. So we'll type clear, capital I, interval, and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to give it an ID that we want to stop. So we'll give it this interval ID. Interval ID. And then at the bottom, let's also change is auto playing to false, because we just stopped it. So is auto playing equals false, and save. So now if we try out this button, it will start playing the game by itself every second. And if we click the button again, it will stop playing the game. So that's how we stop an interval. We need to save the ID and then call clear interval with this ID. So now I'll clean up the code a little by removing this extra line and save. And now we're finished with this feature. So next, let's go back to our advanced functions file. So I'll click up here, and then at the bottom, I'll open 12 advanced functions and hide the files for now. And we're going to learn some more features of functions as values. So let's actually close the other files that we opened. And first, let's comment out the previous code with /* and at the bottom, */. Let's scroll down and save. And let's open the tab for this file. So now we're going to learn another way to loop through an array. First, let's create an array. We'll type square brackets, and inside the array, we'll have the string make dinner and another string wash dishes and another string watch YouTube. So in the previous lesson, we learned how to loop through an array using a for loop or a while loop. Another way to loop through an array is using a method of the array called for each. So at the bottom, let's type dot for capital E each and brackets. So this is the for each method, and it allows us to loop through this array. Inside these brackets, we're going to give for each a function. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets. So again, we're just passing a function into another function. However, this function will be a little different. We're going to give it a parameter. So up here, let's create a parameter called value. So what for each does is that it loops through the array, and for each of these values, it will save the value in the parameter and run the function. So let's console.log value and save. So this will loop through the array and display each value in the console. So let's go through this step by step. So it'll take the first value, save it in this parameter, and run the function. Then it will take the second value, save it in the parameter, and run the function. Then it will take the third value, save it in the parameter, and run the function. So the for each method is actually the preferred way to loop through an array, because this is easier to read than a for loop like this. And for each also has another feature. We can give this function a second parameter. So we can type comma, and the second parameter is the index, or the position of the value in the array. So for the first value, index will be 0. For the second value, index will be 1. Third value, index will be 2, and so on. So above this line, let's also console.log the index and save. And this will also display the index of each value. All right, now let's do a practical example using the for each method. We're going to go back to the to-do list project that we created in the previous lesson. So we'll click up here to show our files. And let's scroll up. And let's open 11todolist.js. So in this code, we used a for loop to display the to-do list on the page. We're going to switch this to using a for each method instead. So first, let's actually make a copy of the files for this project. we'll click up here and let's click 11 to-do list and right click, copy, and let's click the script folder, right click and paste. And now we'll rename this by right clicking, rename, remove copy from the end, and change the beginning to 12 and press enter. Let's also make a copy of the CSS and HTML file for this project. So we'll click the CSS file, right click, copy, click the styles folder, right click and paste. Right click, rename, remove copy, and at the front, change it to 12 and press enter. And finally, we'll scroll down, click 11 to-do list.html, right click, copy, and then down here, right click and paste. Right click, rename, remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, change it to 12 and press enter. Now we can hide these files and we can close the lesson 11 files. And now here, we're going to change the CSS file that we load to 12 to-do list. And we'll scroll down and we'll also change the JavaScript file that we load to 12 to-do list. Now let's save and we'll open this in the browser by right clicking, open with live server. Okay, now let's go back to the JS file. So I'll take this file and drag it to the bottom and I'll rearrange the windows here. We're going to scroll down and we'll change this for loop to use a for each method. So first, let's type above this for loop and we'll type the array that we want to loop through, which is to-do list. And we'll type dot and use the for each method and brackets. Inside the brackets, we'll give it a function that we want to run for each to-do. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets. And this function can have two parameters. The first parameter will contain each value in the array. So we'll call it to-do object. We'll type a comma, and the second parameter contains each index in the array. So we'll just call it index. And now inside this loop, we basically want to do everything that we did here. So let's just make a copy of this code, right click, copy, and then up here, inside for each, right click and paste. So now if we scroll up, we already have the to-do object up here. So we don't need to get it from the array like before. So we can remove this line. And let's also remove these comments. The other thing we have to change is that previously we were using I for the index, but now the index is called index. So we just change this to index. So that's how we use a for each method instead of a for loop. If we compare this code to the for loop that we had before, the for each method is easier to read. So for the rest of this course, we're going to prefer to use for each instead of a for loop. So we're going to remove this for loop. Let's scroll back up and save, and the project still works. So that's a practical example of using the for each method. Now let's go back and learn some more details about for each. We'll close the JavaScript file for now and go back to advancedfunctions.html and open the tab for this file. So in the previous lesson, we learned a feature of loops called continue. Continue lets us skip to the next iteration or the next run of the loop. For each methods don't have continue, but we can do the same thing with a return statement. So let's say in this loop, we don't like washing dishes. If the value is wash dishes, we're going to skip it and not display it in the console. So above, we'll create an if statement. And then inside the condition, we'll check if value is equal to the string wash dishes. And then in the curly brackets, if it is equal, we'll return and semicolon. So this return statement will end this function early, and it will go on to the next function. So it basically does the same thing as continue in a for loop. If we save, you'll notice that it skipped wash dishes. In the previous lesson, we also learned a feature of loops called break. Break lets us exit a loop early. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to break in a for each loop. So if we need to use break to exit this loop early, then it's better to use a regular for loop. Let's take a break before continuing with the rest of this lesson. Here are some exercises that will help you practice what we learned so far. So next, we're going to move on and learn a shorter way to write functions called arrow functions. So let's go to the bottom of this code. We'll create some new lines, and let's create a variable, const. And we'll name the variable arrow function. And we'll make it equal to brackets, equal, greater than, or an arrow, and then curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we'll type some code, console.log brackets and the string hello. And we'll put a semicolon at the end. So this is an arrow function. It works the same way as a regular function. For example, we can call this arrow function by typing the variable name, arrow function, and brackets. If we save, this line of code will run the code inside this arrow function and display hello. So arrow functions mostly work the same way as regular functions. So to compare them, let's actually type above this code. We'll create some new lines and type const regular function equals the word function, brackets, and curly brackets, console.log string hello. So these two syntaxes do the same thing. The difference is that instead of using the word function, an arrow function just uses an arrow. Now, parameters work the same way in an arrow function. We just type the parameter between these round brackets. So here, let's type param, and here as well. If we want multiple parameters, it also works the same way. Up here, we can type comma param2, and down here, comma param2. And finally, return statements also work the same way. So in this function, we can return 5, and in the arrow function, we can also return 5. So now let's learn some differences between these two. Arrow functions have a few shortcuts that regular functions don't have. For example, at the bottom, let's create an arrow function using const, and we'll name it one param and make it equal to an arrow function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Now in this arrow function, we're going to give it one parameter, param. And inside the function, we'll console.log param plus 1. So when an arrow function only has one parameter, these round brackets are optional. So we can actually remove them. If we do one param brackets 2, if we save, it will display 2 plus 1, which is 3. Let's learn another shortcut. We'll create some new lines and type const one line and make it equal to an arrow function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And inside, we'll return 2 plus 3. So when an arrow function only has one line like this, we can actually put it on the same line as the arrow. And now that everything's on the same line, the curly brackets are actually optional. So we can remove them, and we can also remove the return statement. So this is a one-line arrow function. If we just have an arrow, it will automatically return the result on the right. So at the bottom, we can console.log and call the one line function with brackets. If we save, this function will return 2 plus 3, and it will display 5 in the console. So that's arrow functions. It's a shorter way of writing a regular function, and it has a few shortcuts. For now, let's get some practice using arrow functions. So let's scroll up in this code to the for each method. So let's use an arrow function here instead. We just have to remove the word function, and after the round brackets, add an arrow, equals, greater than. If we save, the loop still works. So when we're passing a function into another function like for each, it's recommended to use arrow functions because it makes our code easier to read. So now let's use arrow functions in some of our previous projects. We'll start with the rock, paper, scissors game. Let's open our files by clicking here, and we'll find the 12 rockpaperscissors.js file. And then inside this file, we're going to scroll down to the autoplay function. So here, we're passing a function into another function. So it's recommended to use an arrow function. Let's remove the word function and add an arrow. So now this code is a little easier to read. Now, what about this function up here? Function autoplay. Should we also switch this to an arrow function? So this situation is more personal preference. So above this, let's actually create an arrow function version of this. Const autoplay equals brackets and arrow and curly brackets. So even though we could create an arrow function version of this, I actually prefer the regular function syntax here for two reasons. Number one, I think this is easier to read than this. And number two, this function syntax enables hoisting, which means we can call this function before we create it, and we don't have to worry about which order we write the code. So for these reasons, I actually prefer this situation to use a regular function syntax and not an arrow function. So we'll comment out the arrow function using // and //. Now let's save, and let's open the tab for this project, and we'll give it a try. So click autoplay, and this still works. after replacing with an arrow function. Next, let's go to the to-do list project and switch to arrow functions. So we'll go to our code editor and find the to-do list project, which is here. And let's scroll down. So inside render to-do list, we're using for each, and we're passing this function into another function. So it's recommended to use an arrow function here. So we'll remove the word function, and after the brackets, we'll add an arrow. And again, I'll leave this function syntax as a regular function because it's easier to read and enables hoisting. So let's save and go back to our to-do list, and everything still works. Next, let's go back to 12 advanced functions.html, and we'll scroll to the bottom, and we'll open the tab for this file, and we'll review another place we could use arrow functions, which is inside an object. So at the bottom here, let's create a new object, const object2 equals object. And then inside, let's type the property method, colon, and an arrow function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So even though we could save an arrow function inside an object like this, objects already have a shortcut for functions. So at the bottom, we could just type method, brackets, and curly brackets. So this syntax is called the shorthand method syntax. So this shorthand method syntax is actually easier to read than an arrow function. So when saving a function in an object, it's actually recommended to use this syntax instead. There's also another difference between regular functions and arrow functions, but we'll learn about it later in this course because it's a more advanced feature. Now let's move on, and we're going to learn another improvement we can make to our projects. So let's comment out this code. We'll scroll up and type /*, and at the bottom, */ and save. And next, we're actually going to scroll up to the very top of this file. And we're going to create a button on the page. So inside the body, we'll type less than, button, greater than. And inside the button, we'll have the text click. Now let's say that we want to run some JavaScript code when we click this button. So here, we can type on click equals double quotes and write some JavaScript inside this double quotes. Now we're going to learn a better way of doing this called add event listener. To use add event listener, first we're going to get this button and put it into our JavaScript using document.querySelector. So let's add a class to this button so we can select it, and we'll set it to js-button. And now inside the script element, we're going to use document.querySelector, brackets, and the string .js-button. So now let's save this button in a variable so we can use it later. At the front, we'll type const button element equals this result. Now every HTML element has a method called add event listener. Add event listener lets us run some code when we interact with the element. So it sort of does the same thing as on click. So at the bottom, let's type button element dot add capital E event capital L listener and brackets. So add event listener has two parameters. The first parameter is the event, or what type of interaction we want to listen for. So between these brackets, let's type the string click. So this will run some code when we click the button. The way to find these event names is to look at this attribute. The word after on is the event. Next, the second parameter is a function that we want to run when we click this element. So we'll type a comma, and because we're passing a function into another function, we're going to use an arrow function. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So inside here, let's just do console.log string click and save. And now when we click this button, it will run this function and display click. So this code does the same thing as the onClick attribute. However, add event listener has some advantages over using an attribute. First, it lets us add multiple event listeners for an event. For example, let's add another click event listener. We can select this code and right-click, copy, and then down here, right-click and paste. And let's change this to log click 2. If we save and click the button, it will run both of these functions. So add event listener lets us add multiple listeners to one event. Another advantage of doing this is that we can remove an event listener using a method called remove event listener. So under this code, we can type button element dot remove capital E event capital L listener and brackets. And remove event listener also has two parameters. The first parameter is the event. So in this case, it is the string click. And we'll type a comma. And the second parameter is the function that we want to remove, so that when we click this button, it will no longer run that function. Now, we can't just type a copy of this function. We need to use this exact function inside remove event listener. To do that, we'll save this in a variable first. So above this, let's create a variable const event listener equals, and we'll select this code, right-click, copy, and in here, right-click and paste. And now we'll replace this with the variable event listener. And down here, we'll remove this same variable, event listener. If we save and click the button again, it will only display click 2 because we added this event listener and then we removed it. So it will no longer run this function when we click the button. So as you can see, add event listener gives us more control over event listeners. We can add multiple listeners to an event, and we can also remove a listener from an event. So because of these advantages, the best practice is to use add event listener instead of an onClick attribute. So let's go back into our projects and switch to using add event listener. We'll start with the rock, paper, scissors project. So we'll open our files and we'll open 12 rock, paper, scissors and click here and save. And we'll scroll up to 12 rock, paper, scissors.js. And for the video, I'll drag this down to the bottom. And I'll hide the files for now. And then rearrange the windows. And finally, open the tab for this file. Now let's go to the HTML. We'll scroll up to these move buttons, which is up here. So here we're using the onClick attribute, and we're going to switch it to add event listener. So first, let's get this button into our JavaScript. We'll add a class so we can select it, js-rock-button, and save. And then down here, let's go below the autoplay function right here. And we'll use add event listener. So we'll get this button into our JavaScript using document.query selector brackets and a string dot js-rock-button, and we're going to use dot add event listener brackets. So we're going to listen for a click and a comma, and we'll give it a function that we want to run. So a common mistake here is to actually run the function. For example, play game brackets and the string rock. So we're supposed to give a function to add event listener. However, this doesn't result in a function. This will actually run play game and give us the return value, which is undefined. So this code will actually result in undefined, and then we're giving undefined to add event listener, so it won't work. So in order to give add event listener a function, we need to create a function here. So let's remove this code, and we'll create a function using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And then inside this function, we're going to call play game. So we'll type play game brackets and rock. So now when we click the rock button, it will run this function and play the game. So let's remove the onClick attribute and save the HTML, and also save the JavaScript, and then go to our project and click the rock button. You can see that it works, except this time we're using add event listener. So let's do the same thing for the paper and the scissors button. Feel free to pause the video if you want to try it yourself. So we'll scroll down here, and let's add a class to the paper button so we can select it, js-paper-button, and then in our JavaScript, we'll make a copy of this code. So right click, copy, and then down here, right click and paste. And now we're going to replace the rock button with paper. And when we click this button, we're going to play the game with paper. Now let's save, and we'll remove the onClick attribute and save the HTML. If we click the paper button, it works as before. Finally, let's do the scissors button. So we'll add a class js-scissors-button, and then inside our JavaScript, we'll make a copy of this, right click, copy, and then down here, create some new lines, right click, and paste. And now switch to the scissors button and play game with scissors. Let's save and remove the onClick attribute, save the HTML, and try the scissors button. So everything still works. And I'll leave switching the reset score button and the autoplay button as exercises. So now let's try add event listener with a different event. We'll use it with key down. So let's say that in our project, we want to make it so we can play the game with our keyboard. If we type R, it will play rock. If we type P, it will play paper. And if we type S, it will play scissors. Let's go into our JavaScript and we'll scroll down. And we're going to add an event listener to the body this time, so that if we type anywhere on the page, we can run some code. So we're going to get the body element using document.body and then .add event listener and brackets. This time, the first parameter or the event will be the string key down. And let's type comma and give it a function that we want to run. Brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Inside here, let's just type console.log key down for now and save. So now if we go to the project and we open the console, right click and click inspect, click the console, and then click on the page. If we type a key on our keyboard, it will run this function and display key down. So now we have to check what key was pressed and play the game. So how do we know which key that we pressed? Earlier in this course, we used the attribute onKeyDown, and we learned that it gets a special object called event. And the event object contains which key was pressed. Add event listener also provides this event object, but it provides it as a parameter to this function. So inside the round brackets, let's add a parameter event. Now every time we type on our keyboard, add event listener will save the event object in here and run the function. And this event object contains the key that we pressed. So in the console.log, let's display event.key this time and save. Now if we click on the page and type R, event.key will contain R. If we press P, event.key will contain P. So that's how we know which key we pressed. So now let's close this. And instead of console.log, we'll create an if statement to check which key we pressed. So if brackets and curly brackets. And here we'll check if event.key is equal to the string R. If it is, we're going to play the game with rock. So inside here, we can just run this play game function. Play game and brackets, and inside we'll type the string rock. Now let's check if we pressed P. So we'll add another branch, else if brackets and curly brackets. And in this second condition, we'll check if event.key is equal to the string P. If it is, we'll play the game with paper. So inside here, we'll run play game brackets and the string paper. And finally, we'll check if we pressed S. So at the end, we'll add another else if brackets, curly brackets, and inside here, we'll check if event.key is equal to the string S. If it is, we'll play the game with the string scissors. Now let's save, click our page, and type R, and it plays a game with rock. If we type P, it will play the game with paper. And if we type S, it will play the game with scissors. So that's an example of using add event listener with a different type of event with a key down. If we need the event object, we can get it using a parameter up here. So those are all the features we're going to create for our rock, paper, scissors project. Now let's move on to the to-do list project and switch to Add Event Listener. We'll go into our code editor, click up here, and find 12todolist.html. We'll also scroll up to the scripts folder, find 12todolist.js, and open this file. And I'm going to put it at the bottom here so I can see it side by side. I'll close this for now and close rock, paper, scissors, and then open the tab for this project. Okay, so let's start by switching the Add button to use Add Event Listener. We'll go into our HTML and find the Add button, which is here, and we're going to add a class so we can select it in JavaScript. JS-add-to-do-button. Now let's go to our JavaScript and scroll down. Above the add to do function, we'll get this button into our JavaScript using document.query selector brackets and then a string dot and the class we want to get, js-add-to-do-button. And then after this, we'll use .add event listener brackets. Inside these brackets, we'll give it the event, the string click, comma, and then a function to run when this event happens. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And in here, we just want to do the same thing as the onClick attribute, which is add to do and call this function. Let's save. And then in the HTML, let's remove the onClick attribute and save. And let's try it out. So we'll type a to do, watch YouTube, select a due date, and then click add. And the add button still works as before, but we're just using add event listener. Next, let's switch all the delete buttons. Let's scroll up to where we create these delete buttons, which is here. And first, we'll add a class to all the delete buttons so we can select them in JavaScript. js-delete-to-do-button. And now we're going to use document.query selector and add an event listener to all of these buttons. However, there's two problems here. First is that at this point in the code, this is just a string. We haven't actually put this button on the page yet. We do that down here in this line of code. We put the HTML that we generated onto the page. So in order to add an event listener, we need to put the HTML on the page first. So we have to do it after this code. So down here, we're going to type document.query selector brackets and the string dot, and we'll select this class, js-delete-to-do-button. However, there's also a second problem here, which is we're going to have multiple delete buttons, and query selector only gives us the first one. So how do we select all the buttons on the page that match this criteria instead of just the first one? To do that, the document object has another method called query selector all. So query selector all will give us all the elements on the page that have the class js-delete-to-do button. So down here, let's console.log this result to see what it looks like. Console.log brackets and close bracket and save. And then here, right click, inspect, and the console, and expand this. You'll see that document.querySelectorAll gives us a list of elements. And this list works just like an array. This is index 0, or the first button, and this is index 1, which is the second button. So now let's remove console.log and add event listeners to all of these buttons. To do that, we're going to loop through this list of delete buttons. So again, this list works like an array, so we can use a for each method to loop through it. So at the end, let's type enter and tab, and then dot for each and brackets. As usual, we'll give for each a function that we want to run for each of these values. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now every time we loop through the list, for each will give us two parameters. The first one is the value in the list, which is a delete button element. So let's name it delete button. And we'll type comma. And the second parameter is the index. So index. So now we want to add an event listener to each delete button. So inside here, we'll type delete button dot add event listener and brackets. Inside these brackets, we'll tell it what event we want to listen to, which is the string click and comma, and then a function that we want to run when this event happens. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So now when we click a delete button, we want to do the same thing as this onClick attribute above. So let's select this code. We'll right click, copy, and then down here, right click and paste. And now we can remove these characters because we're not in a string anymore. And that's all we need to do. So to summarize, we used query selector all to get a list of all the delete buttons on the page, and then we looped through the list using for each. And for each delete button, we added a click event listener and ran the same code that we did before. So now we can scroll up and remove this onClick attribute and save. Go back to the page, close the console, and try out the delete button. And you can see that it still works. So that's how we switch the to-do list project to use add event listener. So now we're finished improving all of our projects. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn more features that use functions as values. So let's close this for now, and we'll go back to 12 advanced functions.html. And we'll open the tab for this file. And let's also comment out this JavaScript code using /* and */. Let's save. And now let's scroll to the bottom of this code and create some new lines. So in this lesson, we learned the array method for each, which lets us loop through an array. Now we're going to learn two more array methods called filter and map. So let's start with filter. Let's say we have an array of numbers and we want to create a copy of this array with all the negative numbers removed. So let's go up here and create an array of the number 1, -3, 5, and type the method .filter and brackets. So filter works the same way as for each. We give it a function, so bracket, arrow, and curly bracket. And this function has two parameters, the value and the index. So filter will take the first value, save it in here, and run the function. Then it will take the second value, save it in here, run the function, and the third value, save it and run the function. Now the only difference is that this time, this inner function will return a value. So we'll type return. And we're going to return a Boolean, like true. So now the return value matters. So what filter does is it creates a new array. If the inner function returns true, it will put this value in the new array. If the inner function returns false, it will not put this value in the new array. For example, at the front, let's console.log the result of this. So we'll type console.log, open bracket, and down here, close bracket, and save. So in this example, the inner function always returns true, so all three values will be in the new array. If we change the return value to false every time and save, all three values will not be added to the new array. So now let's use this to solve our problem. We want to remove the negative numbers from this array. So inside this inner function, we're going to return true if the number is positive and return false if the number is negative. So we'll check if value is greater than or equal to 0, curly brackets, we'll return true and include it in the new array. Else, we'll return false and not include it in the new array. So let's remove this and save. So now only values that are greater than 0 will be in the new copy. So using this, we can sort of filter out values based on a criteria. That's why this method is called filter. Now we can shorten this logic by using this code. Return value greater than or equal to 0. So this comparison will return true if it's greater than or equal to 0, and it will return false otherwise. So this line does the same thing as this code up here. So we can comment this out with /* and // and save. And as always, we can return a truthy or falsy value instead of just true or false. The last array method we're going to learn is called map. So let's create some new lines and scroll down. And let's say we have an array of numbers again, like the array 1, 1, 3. And we want to make a copy of this array with each number doubled. So at the end, we'll type dot map brackets, and map works just like for each and filter. Between the brackets, we'll give it a function, bracket, arrow, and curly brackets. And this function will get two parameters. The first parameter is each value in the array, and the second parameter, comma, is the index. So map will take the first value, save it in this parameter, and run the function. Take the second value, save it in this parameter, run the function. Third value, save it, and run the function. And inside this function, we're going to return a value. So what map does is it creates a new array, and then whatever we return will be added to the new array. So if we return 10, and then we console.log this result, console.log, and close bracket, and save, it will create an array where each value becomes 10. Now, the interesting thing is that we can actually use the value itself in the return. So here, if we did value plus 10 and save, it will take each value in the original array, add 10, and put it in the new array. So map will transform an array into another array based on the return value. So if we want to return an array where each number is doubled, we just have to multiply each value by 2 and save. And this will give us 2, 2, 6. Next, we're going to review some shortcuts of arrow functions to make this code more compact. First, let's make a copy of this code. Right-click, copy, and down here, right-click and paste. So notice in the inner function, we're not using index. So let's just remove it for now. And now that this arrow function only has one parameter, these round brackets are optional. So we can also remove these to make the code more compact. Another shortcut is if we only have one line of code in an arrow function, we can put the code on one line like this. And now the curly brackets and the return are optional. So we can actually just remove all of this code. So if we have just an arrow, it will automatically return this result on the right, and we don't have to type return ourselves. So this code does the same thing as the code above. But as you can see, these shortcuts make our code very compact and clean. So let's save, and this will give us the same result. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is a feature of functions called a closure. A closure means if a function has access to a value, it will always have access to that value. So let's take a look at an example. We're going to go back to the to-do list project. So we'll click up here and then scroll up to 12todolist.js and close this, and then open the tab for the to-do list, which is here. And let's scroll down to the query selector all. So we're going to focus on this inner function here. So notice that this function uses index from above. Now the interesting thing about index is that as soon as this for each ends, index gets deleted. For example, if we add some new lines and we try to console.log index and save, and then go into our project, right-click, inspect, and the console, it'll tell us that the index is not defined. So as soon as we end the for each loop, index doesn't exist anymore. However, if we move this into the inner function, so inside here, and we console.log index and save, and we click a delete button, it will tell us that the index is 0. So even though index gets deleted right away down here, if we click one of these buttons later on, it still has access to index. This feature is called a closure. If a function has access to a value, it will always have access to that value. The value, like index, gets packaged together or enclosed with the function. That's why we call it a closure. So even if the value index gets deleted after the loop, we can click the delete button 5 seconds later or even 5 minutes later, and this function will always have access to index. So closures are something that naturally happens as we write JavaScript code, and it's